Welcome back to the Yap section, the show where we talk about pop culture, music, and fashion. I'm your host, Mia, and today we are talking about where's the line in comedy. Recently, Kevin Hart hosted a roast to celebrate basically his big influence on the comedy scene for the last decade, actually probably over a decade, and people had some thoughts. There were a number of controversial figures at the roast, including with some interestingly tasted jokes that got me thinking about comedy as a whole. Comedy as a whole is such an interesting art form because it's meant to poke fun at things that make you uncomfortable, which means oftentimes comedians are walking a very thin line of being, crossing the line and poking fun at people versus poking fun with people in a sense. And there were a few comedians that felt like they crossed the line from poking fun with people to poking fun at people. I think a good rule of thumb when judging comedy is always, don't punch down. And recently in an interview, Dan Levy, who was the showrunner and writer for Schitt's Creek, was talking about how one of the first lessons in comedy that he received was that, don't punch down. Because it just comes across, it goes from like a joke to a dig or just something in very poor taste. And there has to be almost this big amount of awareness when you're a comedian or any kind of public speaking figure, but especially a comedian, of where you kind of reside within society. Society obviously has hierarchies based on class, based on race, based on gender. And so I think being aware of where you fall within those classifications allows you to have a better grip over your comedy. One of the jokes that fell very flat, or at least got a lot of flack for it, was a joke by Shane Gillis where he was talking about Kevin Hart's height, obviously one of the main setups to a joke throughout the night. But his punchline was essentially that to Kevin Hart, you couldn't do it from a real tree, you'd have to do it from a bonsai tree. And I know people are going to be out there and be like, it was funny, it's just a joke, like, don't be so sensitive, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But unfortunately, I feel like we can make those kinds of jokes if it's something maybe very far in the past. However, there are still modern day lynchings happening in various cities across the United States. So for him as a white man to kind of make light of the situation left a bad taste, at least in my mouth. Of course, comedy is subjective. Everybody loves to be like, who is laughing at SNL? Who thinks this is funny? It's me, guys. I'm sorry. I think SNL is hilarious. Like the aerial tramway skit and the HART skit was so dumb. And I would watch it 1,000 times over. Weekend Update, I watch that weekly. But obviously, it's not everyone's kind of humor. And that's okay. Not all humor has to be for everybody. There's so many different ways that you can do comedy. I see that a lot in TV shows as well. Like the comedy of The Office is very different from the comedy of a show like New Girl. However, they're still comedy. At the end of the day, while I do understand comedy is subjective, and again, maybe that joke made somebody laugh, it just wasn't me. Maybe I am too sensitive. I think, again, it just didn't work coming off of the comedian it was coming off of. Maybe, and a very heavy maybe, that joke would have been funny if it was coming off of a black person, someone who, lynch kind of directly affects. But for a white man who it's like, your people are doing the lynch, it just doesn't seem as funny to me. It falls badly. It just isn't a good joke. Comedians really have to also know their audience. And so I think we saw this with Matt Rife, one of the only people, by the way, that I've seen successfully kind of semi-canceled, where Matt Rife's original audience was heavily women. It was a very women-based audience. And then his Netflix special got released, and he made a, in poor taste, in my opinion, joke about domestic violence, basically saying, he went to a restaurant and there was a waitress with a black eye, and they were like, first of all, why didn't they stick her in the back of the kitchen? Who wants to see the black eye? But then on top of that, he was kind of like, oh, well, maybe she wouldn't have had the black eye if she could cook better. And it was like, wow, okay, there's layers of domestic abuse, misogyny, so many things that are just not funny within this joke that coming from a man, doubly not funny. And, sometimes people mess up. I will give them that. I am not a big believer in full-on cancel culture where nobody can ever come back if they don't, kind of repent, say they're sorry, show that they've changed, all that kind of stuff. People do evolve as human beings, and I think we do have to leave space for that. However, in Matt Rife's case, he doubled down on it. He was like, if you didn't find it funny, you're just not my audience. And it was very clear he was trying to cater to not women, basically, and cater to a more male-centered audience who maybe would think that joke was funny. Unfortunately, dude, that's not who was paying your bills at the end of the day. Like, that's not who your audience was. And so from that point on, I have never seen Matt Rife on my For You page ever again. The only other time that I saw him pop up was when Elf got a lot of backlash for the fact that he was featured in a campaign for them. And everybody was like, why do you have this guy who made this domestic violence joke doubled down on it in a ad for a industry that is predominantly, bought by women? So again, the only other time I saw him was for another scandal. He has not popped up on my For You page since. I don't know how his career is doing, but I do have to take a guess that it's at least taken a dip. I doubt, he's like scrounging for pennies on the sidewalk, but he's definitely not where he was at one point when he held that predominantly female audience. And at the roast, we kind of saw, comedians all take digs at each other. I would still like to know whoever decided to get Cat Williams there, give them a raise. Like, don't give them a raise because he should not have been there. He doesn't like Kevin Hart at all. And none of those jokes that he made at Kevin Hart were in good faith. Like, everyone else walked off the stage probably giving Kevin Hart some sort of compliment or like, you've done so much for the industry, Kevin. You're such a funny guy. Cat Williams just kind of gave a big ol' walked off the stage. Two of the comedians that I do want to touch on, though, that had interesting sets towards each other were Chelsea Handler and Tony Hinchcliffe. So not Tony Handler. Hello? Chelsea Handler, I think, was up first and took so many shots at Tony Hinchcliffe, basically making jokes that he was, racist, sexist, part of the KKK, all these other kinds of things. And then Tony Hinchcliffe retaliated by, saying a whole bunch of stuff about how she can't find love, won't have kids. And then at some point, one moment in particular that really stuck in my head is when he called her a frigid bitch. And I think that just kind of stuck in my head because also comedy is a oral art form, you know what I mean? So tone and inflection in a voice is really giving a lot away here. That frigid bitch wasn't a joke. That was just an insult. That was just a dig at her. But I think when you're looking at how they were trading jokes with each other and maybe why Chelsea Handler's were better received by a wider audience than Tony Hinchcliffe's were, is again positioning within society. Chelsea Handler is a white woman taking a shot up at a white man versus Tony Hinchcliffe taking a shot down at a white woman. And it's not to say that I don't think he should have been able to take a shot at her. I do think, however, maybe there was a better way to do it, a more tasteful way to do it, a way that didn't end up essentially punching down. The other part of some of these jokes is it's like, you guys kind of just took the easy road out sometimes. Like, get creative with your jokes and your insults, I beg. Because essentially he just took the dig that's like, oh, she's single, she can't have kids. Wow, what an original idea, dude. And I'm not saying Chelsea Handler's like KKK jokes were all that original or whatever, but I don't know, like sometimes I'm just like, these creatives are very not high effort. Like, you guys are picking the low-hanging fruit and writing a career off of that. And that's why I think I also just find self-deprecating / like within your own kind of lane comedy to be especially funny because it's coming from places of experience. I feel like comedy comes off so much better when you're coming from a place of experience and not trying to co-opt somebody else's experience. What I will say though is I think comedy is almost a severely underrated art form for a few different reasons. One, you can kind of get a pulse on free speech when it comes to comedy at times. Recently, Stephen Colbert's show was canceled despite having like the highest ratings for a late night show ever. And it came after basically taking a shot at Trump and Paramount. And I think his cameras being cut kind of tells us where we're at with free speech. It tells us that, they didn't think the joke was funny, haha, it touched too close to home, and so therefore we got to cut the mics. People aren't free to say what they want to say. And that's why I'm like, while I am not a fan of jokes like the one that Shane Gillis makes, it is also kind of his right, and this is my unpopular opinion, it's his right and prerogative to make those jokes. I'm sure someone out there laughed and thought it was funny. I, for reasons that have been aforementioned explained, don't think they're funny, like, at all. But I would never be, I think, someone who's like, you know, cut his mic, cut his camera. Because I think when you start trying to cut cameras for certain people, you ultimately, you know, start a domino effect of the ability for people to cut cameras for anyone that they don't like what they're saying. And again, I'm not going to say I'm glad he got up there and did that, but I mean, ultimately he ended up showing his ass. All of them who made jokes similar along the lines to that. Oh, the Tony Hinchcliffe joke that landed also very poorly and once again was taking a shot down, and where I'm saying, like, you know, you made that in a public forum, in a public setting, and now we know who or who not we would like to really be associated with or like support, because Tony Hinchcliffe's joke that didn't land very well was a George Floyd joke, which is like a very recent event and clearly a very touchy subject still within the Black community, where he was talking, the punchline was, "I can't breathe," and that George Floyd was looking up at us from hell, basically. And what to even say about that, because that's just so fucked up. I think it tells us a lot about these two comedians that chose to come to a place that was supposed to celebrate Black people, and instead of like finding kind of maybe a funny way to joke about it, I think there were so many jokes that could have been told more so about their community and the impact that they have on the Black community than trying to go for like some of the worst things that have happened within the Black community, from lynching to police brutality. And the fact that that's where your mind went and that you find those situations amusing, I have your number, Shane Gillis and Tony Hinchcliffe. I have your number. Overall, I think that comedy is a good industry to keep an eye on when it comes to free speech, because it tells us who faces the consequences when a line is crossed and who isn't. As Stephen Colbert is now off of the air, and we just recently saw Kathy Griffin now starting to get back a career after it was essentially destroyed for making a Trump joke back in 2017. While they faced dire consequences to their career for poking fun at figures like Trump, Shane Gillis and Tony Hinchcliffe, I'm sure, will go on to have booming careers for the rest of their life, essentially. That's my take on it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube.